So we're still in digestion here. This is part 2, continuing on from where we left off before. So I'll draw a picture of where we were. Essentially, we had drawn a head, and we had a mouth here. So here's our head. Okay, and of course inside the head we had drawn all the different structures just to kind of and then we're going to go down the throat this time. This is going to be new for us. So this goes up here. Don't connect that just yet because there's a reason for that. So your tongue, I'll do the tongue in purple. The tongue is a muscle that's connected sort of here and stretches out like this. Right? There's your tongue. You know, your tongue is the only muscle in your body that's only connected on one end. Most muscles are connected at both ends because they pull on joints and bones and things. And then, of course, we could put in a few little teeth just to remind us that the teeth are in there. Teeth. There we go. Crunch, 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 crunch. And, of course, we said that there were glands situated around. Now, we just drew generalized glands, salivary glands. There's sort of glands up here, and there's a gland. Maybe I'll change the color of those glands. Hang on, so that they stand out better. Let's do them in green. So there are glands in the back here. There's a gland under your tongue. I don't think we drew that one, but there's glands here, there's glands here. And, of course, those secrete saliva into the mouth. And we've already discussed that. What's interesting, though, is that the back of your throat connects up here, and it does connect to your nose, the nasal passages. It's not like a direct tube. The nasal passages go up into your nose, and what you find up here are all these little folds of tissue. But eventually, right, there's a connection, and as you know, you can get stuff from your nose back into your throat. So the nose is connected to the mouth. In fact, also, the ears are connected. There's a tiny tube from the inside of your middle ear that drains into the back of your throat as well. And that's to make sure that the pressure inside your ear remains constant or can adjust. And it's also because it drains infections and things. Another thing that's actually connected to your throat is your eyes. Your eyes, right, have tiny ducts that do connect and drain into the throat. When I was a kid, I remember I had to take eye drops because I had this pollen allergy. And the eye drops, they go in my eyes, and after about 30 seconds or so, I could taste the drops going down the back of my throat. So they're all connected. I also saw a video of somebody who can drink milk or put milk in their mouth and then squirted out their tear ducts, which is really weird too. So all of these things are connected. So if you're going into medicine, you might be an ear, nose, and throat doctor. What do they call them? An otorhinopharyngologist or something like that. There's a big name for it because the doctor obviously is working with all these areas that are connected. Okay, so here's where we're going. Here's where we are. We are going down the esophagus. But before we get to that, we should look at the throat region. So there's a region of the throat. Let me do this in blue so it stands out. Sort of the back area of the throat. And this is called the pharynx. The pharynx. It's basically the back of your throat. So the pharynx is the place where all these things connect. It's the connecting place. So here's what's going to happen when we do this. I'm going to write the words, but I'm not going to write a lot of the descriptions because there's not enough room up here. But you can write what I tell you to write underneath these words or around them, or if you want to keep a separate list going on the side. So the pharynx is the throat, and it's the meeting place of the mouth, the nose, and even the eyes and the ears all drain into this region. You also have, if you think about your throat, when you look into your mouth, if I could draw, let me see if I can draw a picture here. So if you look in your mouth, if this is your lower mouth, right, and you sort of open your teeth up here, so let me just draw some teeth up here. Teeth, teeth. What you'll notice inside is this little hanging dude right at the back of your throat. That's called the uvula, a little dangly guy that hangs down there. The uvula, yeah. The uvula, we really aren't completely sure what the heck the uvula does. We think that when you swallow, it's like a little flap. And when you swallow, what it does is it sort of slams back up against the back of your pharynx, the back of your throat, and kind of blocks the entrance to the nose. So it might be like a blocking of the nose, so when you swallow, stuff doesn't go up your nose. It's not perfect, though, because we've all had something go up our nose when we're trying to swallow, especially if you're trying to laugh at the same time, right? But it's probably something to do with that. So if you're ever wondering that, what that thing is, the uvula, that's that dangly thing in the back of your throat. Okay? It's spelled like this, uvula. Uvula. Okay, so there's the pharynx, which is basically just the throat, the opening to the throat. Below the pharynx, if we continue down with our picture then, is the tube that leads to the stomach. And that's, of course, the esophagus. The esophagus. Now, there are two tubes in your throat. There's also a tube that goes down to your lungs. And so the pharynx is also the place where we find the opening. So we should probably discuss that. I'll draw it on the side here. There's actually two tubes. So if you go down the throat, there's a tube like this. Wait, I'll draw this even better. There's the esophagus, which is sort of the tube in the back. So let's draw a tube sort of here, like that. And then there's another tube, which is sort of in front of it. And this is the tube that you can feel if you rub on your throat. And it's got little ridges on it. It also has, right about here, your voice box, your Adam's apple, which is where your voice and vocal cords are. It's your larynx, right? Your larynx. At the top of this, right about here, there's a little flap. And this little flap is called the epiglottis. Epiglottis. And its job is when you swallow to slam shut and close the trachea. The trachea is the tube going to your lungs. You don't want food in your lungs. So Mother Nature has taken that generalized body plan that we have, where we have an opening at one end and an opening at the other, remember? And it's borrowed. It's borrowed the first part of that opening as another for another system entirely. It's also where we get our air. So our food and our air come in the same way, but they branch off in the throat here and go two different complete paths. And the epiglottis is the little flap of skin that closes down the trachea to keep stuff from getting down into your lungs. Of course, we sometimes do choke. If you choke, it means that food is caught in the trachea where it doesn't belong and you can't breathe, right? If food were to get stuck in your esophagus, that's not as life-threatening, at least not immediately, because it's not blocking your airway. So it's when food, by mistake, squeezes into the trachea, that's what choking is all about. And of course, our response is to then cough and push air up this way to try to knock it back out into our throat so we can swallow it properly. Do you have a question, Dean? The red tube is the esophagus, yeah. Yeah, this is the esophagus. So in this picture, the esophagus is this red tube I've drawn in front here. And that goes down sort of behind the trachea, right? And then the trachea comes out in front and begins the respiratory system. So we'll talk more about the trachea and the respiratory system in our next little session. Okay, now the esophagus. Let's talk about the esophagus. It's a muscular tube. So as I talk, you should be writing this stuff down, right? It's a muscular tube, and the muscles can squeeze in a rhythmic pattern, like almost like milking a cow, but of course none of you have probably milked a cow. So it squeezes at the top, and then it's kind of like if you had a tube of toothpaste and you wanted to squeeze it out, you have to start at the bottom and kind of squeeze your way up to the top, right? If you just squeeze in the middle, the toothpaste doesn't go out, it goes half to the back and half to the front. And there's this weird squeezing of the muscles, and it's called peristalsis. I'll write that down. Peristalsis. And it's a rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscles that line the esophagus. And of course, the job of those muscles is to push the little chunk of food all the way down. Because it works by muscle action, you can actually swallow upside down. You stand on your head and you can still swallow a piece of food, and those muscles will push it basically up your esophagus to your stomach against gravity. That's typically not how we do things. I don't recommend it because it also increases your chances of choking and other kinds of problems like that. So, not something you want to do for fun, but possible. Peristalsis. Okay? So at this point, the lump of food that you've eaten, right, is now basically a chewed up, mushed up mess. It's very liquidy from the saliva. It's all mashed up by your teeth. And we have a name for it. Everything in biology has a name. So this chunk of food that's ready to go, it's called a bolus. A bolus of food. And now it's on its way down the esophagus. It's very soft. And, it's basically more like a big pile of mush, right? And so the esophagus then squeezes that mushy stuff down through this long tube by peristalsis until we get to the stomach. So let's draw the stomach. The stomach is sort of the first place. Well, I shouldn't say the first place. It's sort of like the main digestive spot, right? We saw that digestion can begin. Physical digestion obviously begins in the mouth from chewing, but chemical digestion also begins with the saliva and the amylase that breaks down starches and things in the saliva. But now we get to the stomach, and the stomach has some pretty serious enzymes. Two of the enzymes that the stomach produces are pepsin. Well, pepsin is probably the biggest one, pepsin. And pepsin is, of course, for digesting proteins. It can break apart those complicated protein molecules and separate them into individual amino acids. The stomach also produces HCl, hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid, of course, is acidic. Your stomach has a pH, you remember pH from grade 10, of about 3. It varies from 1 to 3 or so. 1 to 3, I guess we could say. Let's put 1 to 3, give or take. But it usually hovers around there. That's pretty acidic. That's acidic enough to dissolve a penny if you give it enough time. The problem is with your stomach, a penny probably wouldn't stay in there long enough to digest. Your stomach is set up, and the times for going through your system are set up for food, typical food things, which don't require that much time. Maybe an hour or 20 minutes, 30 minutes is plenty. And so we call this mixture that the stomach secretes, we call it gastric juice. Gastric juice. Now here's the problem. These gastric juices are designed to digest molecules. So if they secrete into the stomach, they will digest the stomach. So the stomach has to have sort of a mechanism to prevent the digestion of itself by its own juices. And so what the stomach has is it has a very, first of all, it's a very thick it's a muscular wall, but the cells also secrete mucus. So there's lots of gooey mucus. And the mucus of the stomach protects the stomach from the acids, so that the acids and the gastric juices will not digest it. Okay? Writing all that down, I hope, right? So we have the pepsin, and did you write down that pepsin is for digesting proteins, and the HCl is for digesting just about everything else, kind of. Softens it all up. HCl will digest bone. Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. So this gastric juice is digesting everything, but the mucus layer that the stomach secretes protects it from its own gastric juice. And you should also write somewhere that the stomach is quite muscular. There are smooth muscles all around the stomach, and that's what, of course, when it contracts, causes the churning and physical digestion of the stomach. So not only does the food sit there and digest in the acids and the gastric juice, but of course the stomach is very slowly moving and churning and mixing the food around to make sure that everything gets digested quite well. In some people, the protective mucus layer gets thin for various reasons. We used to think it was because of stress, and it can be, but we've now found out that the more common cause of that is a bacterial infection. A bacterial infection can get sort of established in the stomach, on the stomach wall, and it can cause the mucus layer to thin, and it irritates the tissues. And if that happens, if you have a spot, just imagine here, I'll erase a bit of mucus there. Now what happens is the stomach's own digestive juices are going to sort of be attacking that wall of the stomach. And they're going to cause this region to become very sore and maybe start to bleed and give you stomach pains and so on. And this is what we call an ulcer. An ulcer, right? Ulcer is a word that refers in medicine to any kind of sort of sore that's been abraded and oozing and you know. But in the stomach, a stomach ulcer is quite a common thing. And typically they used to be thought of as stress-induced, and many of them can be, but we've also noticed that sometimes it's a bacterial infection, so we can actually treat them more effectively with antibiotics rather than with relaxing and antacids and things like that. Dean? Yeah, if the acids do seep through, or if the mucus layer becomes thin for any reason. Now the other thing about the stomach that we should put on our picture, I'll use purple, is there are two muscular rings. These are called sphincter valves or sphincter muscles. They're round. Okay? So and they sort of go around here, and there's one around here. And they have names. I'm going to write the names sort of down here because I can't reach them. Well, you know what I can do? I can erase ulcer. We don't need that anymore. We've already written that down, right? So this this sphincter at the top here, he's called the cardiac sphincter. Now, he's called that because he happens to be close to where the heart is. In your body, your stomach is right sort of below your breastbone, and your heart is right above it. So at the top of the stomach, you know, the heart is sort of up in this region right here. And so because it's close to the heart, they called it the cardiac sphincter. It has nothing to do with blood circulation or that. It's just named because of where it is. And then the one down here is called the pyloric sphincter. Now, sphincter muscles are neat because they're circular muscles, and when they contract, they shrink up and close things off. So let me just draw a picture here. When a sphincter muscle is relaxed, here's a relaxed sphincter muscle, right? Maybe I'll just color them all in here. But if the muscle tightens up, then what happens is the sphincter closes off. It basically shrinks like this. It's like an elastic, right? And what that does then is it causes the the tube that it's around to close. So these sphincters, what they do is they open and close or seal off. Because, of course, we don't want stomach acid leaking out into the esophagus or going somewhere where it doesn't belong, because the stomach is protected, but the other organs aren't. So when you eat, these sphincters can close, seal up the stomach while it's doing its thing. Now, because they're muscles, they're not perfect, right? And sometimes what can happen is especially the cardiac sphincter, it might not fully close. And if it doesn't, then that means that acids and gastric juice can seep. What color am I on now? Let me use, I'll use green again. The juices could seep up here into the lower esophagus. And if they do, they burn, right? They start to burn the tissues of the esophagus, which doesn't have protective mucus. And that's because, again, because it's close to where the heart is, we call this heartburn, but it has nothing to do with the heart. Heartburn is when the gastric juices are seeping up into the esophagus. Another term for this is something called acid reflux. If you've ever heard of that, some people have it. And it causes pain. It can sometimes feel like a heart attack because it's a burning feeling right in your chest where your heart is. And the first time you get it, you think, oh my God, what's happening? I feel like my heart's on fire. But it's not. It's a digestive issue. And it's because this cardiac sphincter isn't fully closed. Why wouldn't it fully close? Well, genetics could be one thing. But if you eat a ton of food, right, Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, and you pack the stomach so full that the food is putting pressure on that, it'll push open that sphincter muscle at the top and cause leaking into the esophagus. Or if you eat a lot of gassy foods that produce gas, which builds up pressure. Of course, that's what a burp is, right? The gas in your stomach. Hydrochloric acid reacts with foods and makes gases. So gas is quite common in the stomach. And so what happens is as the gas builds up, it kind of pushes the stomach like a balloon, and then that little sphincter will pop open and the gas will come out, and then it'll close up again. But sometimes the burp will bring with it a splash of gastric juice, right? So you get those sort of burps that are kind of halfway between burp and barf, you know? And you get that little sort of burning and it's gross. Yeah. Another thing you might notice, I've noticed this as I've gotten older. I guess as you get older, things just start going wrong. But if I sleep on my left side, I have no trouble at night. But if I sleep on my right side, sometimes I will get acid reflux into my esophagus. And that's because of the position of the stomach when you sleep. The stomach sort of sits on a bit of an angle. Like if I draw this picture here, in your body, the stomach actually sits more on a bit of an angle, something like that. So if you lean over on one side, your food is sort of sloshing against this side of the stomach and nothing happens. But if you lean over on the other side, your food is sort of sloshing here, and that puts more pressure on the cardiac sphincter, and you do tend to get a little bit of acid reflux. So as you get older, muscles get weaker, I guess, and you may find that you can only sleep a certain way. Getting older sucks, trust me. Things just start breaking, they don't work right, they fall apart, and that's what happens. Okay, any questions about the stomach then? So we should understand that it produces pepsin for the digestion of proteins, which produces HCl as the digestive acid, and that's called gastric juice. The gastric juice is everything in the stomach. It also includes the mucus that's protecting the stomach, all secreted by the cells. Remember how the cells that line the stomach are making and secreting this into this opening. Because remember, this is outside the body. This is a hole. This is the donut hole inside your body, right? It's a big long hole so far. All right, now after a while, the food, I should mention something else. There's a new name for the food once it sort of hits the stomach and starts digesting. It was a bolus before, remember? So we call this chyme. Stomach stuff is called chyme. That's the word that refers to the food and the juices all mixed together in your stomach. And by the time it's done in there, it's very watery and liquidy. Very liquidy and watery, right? Well, because we've added all that juice to it. It's already been chewed up. Now it's been digested by acid, so it's pretty much a very liquid, whereas the bolus was more of a pasty goo type substance, right? The bolus is more like oatmeal, and this is more like soup broth, beef stock, right? Chicken stock. Chyme starts with a CH, but it's not a ch, it's a k, chyme. Okay, what happens after the stomach now? Well, eventually, we get to the point where everything's digested. The chyme is pretty much as digested as it's going to get. And it's going to pass through the pyloric sphincter into the next section, which, of course, is the small intestine. Now, this is going to get a little bit trickier to draw because the small intestine, so what I'm going to do is I'll draw the stomach again, sort of up here, and then we'll just have the next part coming out. So you can remind yourself that that's the stomach that we've now left behind. The small intestine is all coiled and twisted up because it's very long. And of course, this is the place where now that we've digested everything, our main goal changes to now let's absorb all the good stuff that's in there into our bloodstream through capillaries. So the small intestine is basically the interface for getting stuff actually into your body. Remember the donut hole? We still are in the donut hole, so now we have to get the important things we want to squeeze into the dough of the donut or into our cells or into our bloodstream. So I'm not going to be able to draw, the intestine all coiled up and twisted, but what I'll do is I'll just draw sort of some little like tubes like this. So here's our intestine. Okay. The first part of the intestine has a special name. It's called the duodenum. The duodenum. Okay, so remember there's a sphincter here that keeps that sealed, so it only opens when the stuff in the stomach is kind of ready to come out. And the chyme now spills into the duodenum. Okay? This is where we need the help of another organ. It's part of the digestive system, but it doesn't deal directly with food. Food doesn't pass through it. What's interesting about the digestive system is there's the things in the tube, the donut hole that we've been talking about, but there are sort of organs around there that help out, but they don't actually touch the food or get involved with the food. So right around here in your abdomen is another organ called the pancreas. The pancreas, when you look at it, it looks like a weird leaf shape. And it's very granular. If you do dissections, the pancreas falls apart very easily. It's a kind of a granular organ. But it does some very important things. In fact, it does two things. Let's write pancreas on the side here. Pancreas. P-A-N-C-R-E-A-S. Pancreas, right? There's two important things that it does that are related to digestion. One is, right now, we've got this stuff coming in from the stomach, and it's very acidic. And we don't want to burn the intestines, do we? So what we do is the pancreas is connected here via a duct. So there's a tube. I'll draw it here, but obviously this is not the actual position of anything. The pancreas is really sort of, well, we'll look at some internet pictures of your guts to see where everything is sort of situated, right? But the pancreas secretes something very important. It secretes what's called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate solution. Bicarbonate is a special molecule that's the opposite of an acid from grade 10. You'll remember it's called a base. And a base can neutralize an acid and take away the acidity, reducing it to a pH more like 7, which is neutral and won't burn anything. And so the bicarbonate solution is pushed into the duodenum right at the start by the pancreas to sort of neutralize the stomach acid and prevent it from causing any further damage as it goes. So that's kind of important, right? Put an arrow there to show that movement of the bicarbonate solution. Now the other thing that the pancreas does is it secretes something called insulin. And we're going to talk about the role of insulin later. Insulin doesn't really have anything to do with the digestion of the food, but it's a very important hormone that basically tells our cells to suck the glucose out of the bloodstream after digestion has put it there and make it usable for making energy. So we'll come back to insulin later. Here, in terms of digestion, we want to focus on just the bicarbonate solution. Okay, so now what happens is the absorption process begins. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our little trick. We're going to take a little microscopic blow up. We're going to take a section of this and we're going to blow it up like this to see what it looks like if you really get down to it on the magic school bus, right? And what we find is that the intestine is lined with a whole bunch of little ridges. The red line actually looks more like this when you look at it under the microscope. It looks like that. And we call these little finger things, these are all pointing to the inside. So the fingers are sort of inside like this. And here's the sort of outside of the intestinal wall. We call these villi. Villi, these little extensions. I'll write it up here, V-I-L-L-I. One of them alone would be called a villus, but we never usually refer to one, so it's a villi. Plural in Latin is an I sometimes. And of course, what this does is it increases the surface area, right? If you were to imagine a flat intestine, and in here is all the goopy fluid that's coming out of the stomach, the chyme, well, it's only going to be able to touch the wall of the intestine over a very short, over a very small spot. But if you imagine what's happening here, it's able to touch over a much larger surface area because of these projections, which means we can get more absorption happening. So these villi are increasing the ability of the intestine to absorb by increasing its surface area on the inner side. But it doesn't end there. We're going to blow up one of these villi a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to wait a second. All right, so let's take one of those villi right here. Let's take this guy and let's blow him up into a bigger picture down below and see what that looks like. So when we blow it up now, we can almost start to see the actual cells. Okay? So I'm going to get really small here, or fine thing. What we can see here is that we can actually start to see that, oh, how come it didn't go small? Try again. Red, small, fine. We can see that the villi is actually made up of individual cells, like this. So we'll make all this little chain of cells that go all the way around the outside. That's how small we're talking now. Okay, so that's the red line that I drew up here, the villi line. But it's actually a row of cells. I'm going to have to go down a little bit. Okay, so, and then it would go this way, right? Inside the villi, we have arteries. I should have drawn them in a different color, but that's okay. We have arteries that come in, and the arteries, of course, are branching down into smaller arterioles and then eventually into capillaries. So this would be a very small arteriole, and it would move in here and get my smaller. And of course, it would form a bed of capillaries. And then tangled in that, so it's basically like, let me just go back here. It's like a branch, right? It's not just one, it branches into a whole bunch of capillaries. And then those capillaries, right, connect to the opposite side on the way out, and they all sort of branch back into a venule. So what we have in here is a network of capillaries, right, where blood is moving in this way, goes into here, and as it goes in, remember, the fluids particles that are here are now able to diffuse across the membrane of the cells that line it right? They diffuse across, and usually it's by concentration gradients because there's usually far more of this in the intestine. Remember, this is the inside of the intestine here, right? It's inside the tube. And all this food can now slip through there. It'll diffuse through the membrane of that cell. It'll diffuse right through that cell and into the capillaries. And now it's in the blood. And then it will follow the capillaries, and eventually it will make its way out into the veins, go back to the heart, and be spread throughout the entire body. So the sugars and some of the food, the fats and things that we need, the amino acids for protein making and so on, are being shuttled into the blood at this point, inside these villi. But it doesn't end there. To make it easier for those foodstuffs right here to get through, and to increase the surface area even more, these little red cells, I'm going to blow them up one more time. Let's take this group, well, not that group, sorry, undo. Let's take a group of these cells right here, and let's blow them up and look at them even closer under the microscope. And what we find is that each of those cells, bigger now, each of those cells that's forming the villi has little tiny extensions on the other side of it, the inside part, like this. The cell membrane is actually extended in almost like little tiny villi of its own. These ones are called microvilli. Right on the cells. And so again, here's the particles of food that we want to get into our bloodstream. And so we have an increase of the surface area of the cell membrane so that we can get far more stuff transported across here and into these cells so that we can then transfer it into the bloodstream up here. So it's a double whammy of surface area increasing. The villi themselves are on the wall of the intestine, and they are formed by the cells that make that wall. But each of those cells, each one of those cells has its own membrane extensions called microvilli. So the surface area inside your intestines is immense. It's immense. I've heard all kinds of calculations where if you were to take all of these villi, these microvilli and villi, and flatten them out to see how much area it was, it's something like a football field, right? It's incredible. And that's how we can manage to get so much absorption happening within the intestine. So that structure is quite important. Okay. So this is where we get most of the absorption is happening here. And we're still in the first part of the intestine. Remember, the duodenum. All right? Okay. Then we move sort of, let's go back to our picture for a second, up here. So let's now continue with the rest of the intestine, the next two pieces, because there's actually 3 different pieces to it. Am I good? Can I move ahead? All right. So we've already come out of the stomach, and we've gone through the first part of the intestine, which we call the duodenum. And now we're going to enter the second part of the intestine. So the second section. Okay. Actually, I'm going to put all 3 sections on here. I think we can do the next 2. So the duodenum is sort of the first part. Let's put a little thing like that. And then over here we have the sort of the next section. And then we have sort of the last section of the intestine, right? So next section is called the jejunum. So we'll write that over here. I'm going to get a thinner. This section is called the jejunum. And then the last section is called the ilium. Okay. By the time the food gets through the duodenum, a lot of the particles have already been absorbed into the blood, a lot of the sugars and things like this. But what's interesting is there's still a little bit of breaking down going on while this is happening. Although the stomach is the primary source of digestion, that chyme, as it's moving through the intestines, it can continue to work. For instance, some of those pepsin enzymes that the stomach put in are still kind of working away at it. The acid has been neutralized, so there's not much acid digestion anymore. But the enzymes are still working slowly, so it's kind of there's still some digestion in the process. And so what happens is the jejunum is still breaking down some of the proteins and bigger carbohydrates. All right? So in the jejunum, we tend to see more absorption of the molecules that took a little longer to digest. Did you write all that down? Digestion of proteins, bigger carbohydrates, larger molecules that are still remaining. And of course, they are absorbed in the same way. I'm not going to draw the villi again, but the entire small intestine has the same structure basically. Is there a question, Dean? The jejunum. So yeah. So what it's doing is there's a continuing digestion as the food moves through the duodenum. The enzymes like pepsin are still working away at breaking up the proteins into the smaller proteins and smaller, what we would call a little polypeptides and amino acids. So the jejunum is absorbing now some of those molecules that took a little longer to digest. So proteins and large carbohydrates, starches and things like that. Okay? All right. And then the ilium, it's sort of the back end of the intestine. So the villi are fewer and smaller because we've absorbed almost everything by now, right? But the ilium is still absorbing sort of whatever's left, whatever it can grab at the end, okay? So remember, it's time dependent. So as the food or the chyme is moving through the intestine, whatever's already digested is absorbed very quickly by the duodenum. But some of the foods are still digesting slowly in there, and so they get digested by the jejunum and then absorbed. And then if there's anything left, the ilium grabs what it can. And then the ilium basically is the end of the small intestine, and it ends in, we're going to go next to see what happens after we get out of the ilium. We're going to essentially enter the large intestine, or the colon. So we're almost done. We could probably finish this in a couple of minutes, and then we'll take a little stretch of the legs. Okay, can I go ahead? All right. So now, we've gone through the stomach. There's our stomach. We've gone through the small intestine. And over here, on the sort of right side of your body, the small intestine ends, the ilium comes out, and it joins the colon. Okay? So let me, I'm going to draw the colon here in red. There's a little sort of widened area, like this, and then the colon wraps up like this, and it runs across like this, runs down the other side like this, and then it does a little loopy S shape, and then it opens up here, and basically we're out. So it's the last sort of stage. The little pouch that I've drawn here where it opens up, that's called the cecum. Let's see here. I'm just going to go to the colon, large intestine. Yeah. So we have what's called the cecum. And there's a little flap here. There's an interesting little extension. I'm going to put a little finger-like projection here. Right? We have the this little projection, which is called the appendix. The word appendix means a little add-on. When it was first discovered, this little wiggly tube stuck here, it was like, what's that for? We didn't really know. It was like an add-on. What we've discovered is that in some animals, especially herbivores who eat a lot of plants, their appendix is huge compared to ours. Ours is about the size of your baby finger. Theirs is much larger. And we realize that the appendix plays a role in the digestion of vegetable matter, herbivores. It's a lot harder to digest foods that come in plants because they're not soft and squishy like meats and fats. They're covered in waxy cuticles. The leaves are very tough, fibrous material. They have to be chewed up, in some cases chewed, swallowed, and then chewed again, and then swallowed. Like a cow will actually regurgitate its food and chew it a second time, and then swallow it again. Right? They call that chewing the cud. You ever heard of that? It's kind of gross, but that's what they do. And so the appendix in herbivores is very important. In carnivores, not so important. And so what's happened is it's gotten smaller over evolution in animals that eat less and less, or rely less heavily on a herbivorous diet. So humans, of course, are kind of omnivores. We eat a little bit of both, so we still have a small appendix. But what can sometimes happen is little bits of the digested stuff get in here and can block it off. If it becomes blocked by food particles or something, it can easily become infected. And if it becomes infected, it will begin to swell up. And if it begins to swell up, it could potentially burst. And if it bursts, it will spill all this contents of your intestines into your body cavity inside. It's not supposed to be in there, right? This is all gross stuff. In fact, this is basically everything we don't want from the food we ate, because we've already absorbed all the good stuff in the intestine. This can kill you. This infection can rapidly spread throughout your body, through your bloodstream, and you can die. This is appendicitis, is the condition where your appendix becomes swollen and inflamed and sore. Right? Many people have this, and hopefully it doesn't burst. The idea is the doctors get to it before it bursts, and we found that if we just go in there, we just kind of tie it off, snip it out, sew it up, and take it away, that doesn't seem to bother you much at all. You can live a pretty normal life without any real concerns if you don't have your appendix. And so we used to call it what's called a vestigial organ, a leftover of evolution that we really don't use much anymore. And it is partially vestigial, but we also notice it does have an important role in humans that is not really related to digestion, but it serves as a storage pouch for bacteria, because in the colon that we're about to explore, there is tons of bacteria. And these bacteria do some very important jobs. All the gunk that's in here that we couldn't absorb in our intestines is broken by the bacteria, broken down by the bacteria and made into useful stuff. Yeah, so if you look at my picture, it's quite small, but you're just cutting off the little pouch here. So you can still go through this way, right? All the infection? Well, they close it off. So if this is a bigger picture of your appendix, and this is the cecum, right? So what happens is they tie it off, like with a string, right? And then they just take this out of your body through surgery, right? Well, no, then they sew this up. And so then you basically have this. If I erase the appendix, that's what you end up with, right? And so you're right. You've lost your appendix. And so what I was just about to say was that the appendix can store the bacteria. So you know what, every once in a while you get the runs like crazy, you get a flu or you eat something, and what the runs do is they flush out your colon. But they flush out all the bacteria that are in there that were actually helping you. So we now realize that the appendix is like a little pocket that holds the bacteria while you're flushing it out to get rid of the flu bugs and germs and everything else, so that later the bacteria can repopulate the colon more easily. Now, the nice thing is if you don't have an appendix, the flushing out of the colon when you have the runs does not eliminate all the bacteria. It only eliminates some. And there's always some remnants left over that will repopulate the gut, the colon. So it's not critical. It's not like you're missing out on the bacteria. It just might make it a little bit tougher for you to repopulate what we call the flora of your colon, the bacteria that live there. So that's the whole deal of the appendix. Yeah. All right, so the colon is divided up. This side over here, in your body, it's kind of going up the right side of your body. So it's called the ascending colon. Ascending colon. And then the part over here, which is kind of going across underneath your rib cage, is called the transverse colon. Then there's a part over here that's going then down on your left side, which is called the descending colon. And then there's the little squiggly part, which is S-shaped. So S in Latin is sigma. So we call this the sigmoid colon. It's S-shaped, but we use the Latin word sigma, sigmoid colon. It's the last section. So in the medical world, they divide it all up like this. And then, of course, we have at the bottom, I guess I should move this little bracket a little bit more like that, because the last part, which I'll do in the red's getting confusing, this last section is called the rectum. And the rectum is kind of like a storage, basically a storage area to hang on to whatever's in there until it's more convenient for you to get rid of it. And then, of course, right at the end is the anus. Okay? So we need to talk about what this colon does. So what does the colon do? Well, maybe I will write a few points for the colon. Have you got all that? No? I'll wait. Okay, so this large intestine, or colon, is quite a bit wider and has a larger diameter than the small intestine. It's also quite a bit shorter. It's basically, it goes up your one side across and down, and it's probably not quite a meter long. Whereas your intestines can be about 10 meters long, your small intestine. Okay, so what is this doing? Well, think about where we're at. We've eaten this food, we've chewed it up, we've digested the crap out of it in the stomach. It's gone through the small intestine, and we've slowly absorbed all the things we want to get out of it. So what's left is basically what's left at this point in our food. Well, what's left is undigestible material. I think that should be digestible or digestable. I don't know if it's an able or an ibble. I think it's an able. Undigestible foods. One of the things that humans don't digest very well is a kind of polysaccharide. It's a carbohydrate that plants use to make their cell walls, and it's called cellulose. So that's one of the things that we can't digest. We don't have the proper enzymes in our stomach or our intestines to actually get this to break apart. So it basically keeps on going through, and it never gets absorbed. It's a very large, starchy molecule that's too big to absorb. Now, it does have a purpose, though. Because it doesn't get digested and absorbed, it keeps pushing through the intestines. So remember I talked about that peristalsis motion? Well, the intestines also push food by peristalsis. And this cellulose is what we call fiber. And it is sort of something we're supposed to eat because it keeps bulk in the stuff that we're moving through and makes it easier for the intestines to push it. So fiber isn't really useful to us as a nutrient, but it's useful to us because it keeps the tube clean. It keeps it easier to move the stuff through the tube so it doesn't get backed up in there. Because if it does get backed up in there, something's going to happen, as we'll see in a minute. So, it'd be a shame for our body to just eliminate all this undigestible stuff if it were useful. It would be like throwing out a bunch of your Legos. because you couldn't build your tower out of them. What if you wanted to keep them? It turns out that there is a way for us to get more out of the food, even though we ourselves can't digest it. And that, of course, is the bacteria. Bacteria live in the colon, lots of them. E. coli, Escherichia coli is a very common bacteria that lives in here. You might have heard of E. coli poisoning and things, right? Like the E. coli that lives in the colon of cows, comes out in their manure, gets on food like romaine lettuce, and then we eat it and get sick. And that's because E. coli bacteria is very helpful in the colon, but it's very unhelpful anywhere else in your body. So your colon is a highly sort of dangerous place. It's full of bacteria, but it's contained in the colon. And while it's in there, this bacteria can digest some of these undigestible foods that we can't. They have enzymes that our bodies don't, and they can digest the cellulose, the fiber, and they can use that fiber to grow and do their thing. In the meantime, when they digest it, they make byproducts. So bacteria digest the undigestible foods left in the colon and produced usable byproducts. A lot of these byproducts are things like vitamins and salts and various things that our body could still use. So the byproducts that come out of here, the byproducts of the bacterial action, the bacterial digestion, are useful. They can be things like vitamins, salts, minerals, and so on. Now, how do we get them? How do we get that stuff? Because you need to absorb. It has to get into our blood, right? Well, it turns out the other thing that the colon does is it reclaims water. Water is very easily pulled out of the digested gunk and into our bloodstream. And of course, as you pull out the water, a lot of these things are dissolved in the water, so they kind of move with the water. They follow the water because of concentration gradients and complex chemistry like that. So remember what I told you, the stuff that goes out of your stomach is like soup. It's like a broth. It goes through your intestines and stuff is getting absorbed, but it's still pretty brothy when it hits the colon. So now the colon is pulling out the water and drying it out, essentially, because your body doesn't want to lose that water. So as it reclaims the water, what's left inside, of course, thickens, and we all know what that turns into, right? Poop. And of course, most of what your poop is, believe it or not, is dead bacteria that have come from your colon, a great portion of it. It's kind of why it's so smelly, because bacteria, they don't use the same metabolism we do. They burn or digest and metabolize these byproducts like cellulose and stuff, and they produce things that are smelly, like hydrogen sulfide gas and things like that. So that's kind of the trade-off. So we are getting stuff out of these bacteria. They're helping us in the colon, but they're also producing some smelly stuff that we don't really like. So by the time it actually comes out, then of course it goes to the rectum, and the rectum is essentially a stopping place or a storage place, just so that you're not constantly leaking poop, so that you can hold on to it and you can eliminate it when it's convenient. And then, of course, it's eliminated through the anus. The anus is also a sphincter muscle. The anus is the last sort of step. The anus is a sphincter muscle, a sphincter that closes the final end of the digestive system. Okay, so the large intestine is reclaiming water, and it houses the bacteria that break down things that we can't, and we then can absorb some of the useful byproducts of that as well. So there's still some absorption of some things that we can use in the large intestine. Now, the large intestine is interesting because the amount of water that it pulls out is regulated by your brain and glands that secrete hormones to control it. And so at times, you can suck out lots of water and your poop gets very dry. Other times, they don't suck out much water at all and your poop is very runny. When you're sick and you're trying to eliminate germs from your body, one of the ways they do it is to keep the feces very liquidy and you get the runs. That's why you get the runs often when you have a flu or a sickness. It changes the hormonal action on the large intestine and makes it not take much water out. Of course, there is a problem. If the food doesn't move through properly, it's not really food anymore, but if the feces don't move through the colon, think about this, then the longer they stay in there, the more water that gets sucked out and the drier it becomes. If it gets too dry, the peristalsis can't push it, and you are now constipated. And that can be a small problem that you can solve with some laxatives and possibly a better diet. Or it can be a big problem where you can get a blockage of your colon and possibly even need surgery to fix it. Okay? So constipation is normally a thing that it's like an inconvenience, but at times it could be threatening. The way you avoid that is to eat a diet high in fiber. The fiber then provides the bulk that pushes the food through faster so that it doesn't dry out too much on its way. You see, it's all about a balance. Okay, we have one more thing I have to mention, and then we'll be done with this. It's been a long haul. You'll notice that if I go all the way back to the stomach, the digestive juices of the stomach were the pepsin. Where is it? Where are you, stomach? The pepsin and the hydrochloric acid, right? The digestive juices of the stomach. Then we went down to the pancreas, and we talked about the bicarbonate solution to neutralize the acid. But the pancreas also secretes something else. So what I want to do is maybe at the end of this, because it's harder for you to go back to your pictures, let's talk a little bit more about the pancreas. Pancreas, and two other things we haven't talked about yet, the liver and the gall bladder. Okay, so what the pancreas is doing, let's talk about the pancreas, just in general. We saw that it secretes bicarbonate solution, right? To neutralize the acid. The HCl from the stomach. But this solution also contains some digestive enzymes, which are, again, molecules that act as catalysts to help break stuff down. So remember how I told you that the food, as it works its way through the duodenum and the jejunum, and the ilium is still a little bit digesting, right? It's not all done when it leaves the stomach. And the pancreas has squirted in a whole bunch of these digestive enzymes as well to help break down the proteins and sugars and whatnot that's there. So the pancreas also helps by secreting some of these enzymes, okay? And then I said what the pancreas does is it also secretes insulin. It doesn't secrete insulin into the intestine. It secretes insulin directly into the bloodstream. So this isn't really connected to digestion or the food. But it does this when blood sugar gets high. So think about this. Sugar is being rapidly absorbed by your intestine into your capillaries and into your blood. So your blood sugar level is going up. Now that sugar flowing through your blood needs to be used by mitochondria in your cells. So we have to get the sugar from the blood into all of your individual cells. And in order to do that, on the outside of your cells, on the membrane, there are special protein gates that will allow sugar or glucose to go in. But you need insulin to activate them. So the insulin basically lodges onto the membrane and allows for the cell to start pumping glucose in, taking glucose into the cell where it can go to the mitochondria and be burned. So if you don't have enough insulin, or any insulin, as some people who are diabetic, the problem you have is you can eat all the food you want, fill your blood with sugar, but it can't get into your cells. So it never gets used. And then the high levels of sugar in your blood never go down, and that creates a whole host of other problems and issues in your biochemistry, which results in the condition we call diabetes. Okay, last thing, we're almost there. What about the liver? The liver has many jobs, detoxifying things, breaking down toxins, but it also has a digestive role. You'll notice we talked about pepsin for digesting protein, and we talked about the carbohydrates, but we haven't talked about fat yet at all. How does the fat get digested? Fat is actually tough to digest because fat tends to clump together in big, large clumps, right? Like in your dishwater, the big blobs. And if it's in big, large clumps, and it's hard to break it down. So the liver has a solution that it secretes into the duodenum. It secretes bile. Bile is a teeny, weird liquid. Bile, and it contains a lot of salts, which what they do is they react with the fat molecules and keep them from congealing together. Secretes bile. So what this does is it's called emulsifying. Emulsify fats. So here I'll show you what that means with a picture. Fat molecules, like lipids, will tend to group together in big, large blobs, which are hard to digest. These blobs are big enough to see. They're very large. So what the bile does is it sort of reacts with each of, or it sticks on to each of the fat molecules, and it keeps the molecules sort of separate, so they can't join together. And now they're easily moved around and dissolved, and then digestive enzymes can get at them very quickly, and we can digest them. So emulsifying essentially means to take big blobs of fat and shake them up and attach salts to them so they won't stick together. So now you have individual fat molecules sort of floating in the solution, making it easier to digest. And then the enzymes can get at them and can break down the fats. So the liver does this job for us. Now, we don't secrete this steady. So what the liver does is the liver secretes the bile. Liver secretes the bile, and the bile then goes through a small tube, the gall bladder. Another word for this bile is gall. In the old days, we used to call this gall. It goes to the gall bladder. 1L. Gall bladder. 1L or 2? I'm pretty sure it's 1. And the gallbladder sort of holds on to, oh, it's 2 L's, my mistake. Gallbladder holds on to the bile until it's needed, because you're not eating all the time, right? And then the gallbladder then secretes the bile. Doesn't really secrete. Secrete's a special word in biology that means to be squirted out of a cell. So the gallbladder, I'm going to say, delivers the bile to the duodenum. The duodenum. And so that's the liver's role in digestion. So now we've covered everything. We've covered the stomach, which makes the pepsins to digest the proteins. The pancreas secretes enzymes that help digest proteins and carbohydrates. The amylose helps digest carbohydrates from the saliva. I believe the pancreas secretes more amylose later on to help break down more starches. And then you have the liver, which is secreting the bile, which is another solution to help take care of the fats. So there's 3 different approaches here. So the liver and the pancreas and the gallbladder are not part of the tube. Food never goes through them, but they add stuff to the digestive tract to help the digestion take place. So we'll stop there because that's been a nice long story, over an hour, and we'll take a little break.